very kind remarks that I've just heard, and thank you for the honour of being your patron. I think I was due to speak to you about 6 months ago, but I was second guest with an appointment in Scotland and couldn't be here, but I'm delighted to be here at last. I'm not sure exactly what you would like me to talk about. I'm going to talk about Brexit because it is the big issue of the day. I could say a little bit about my long-standing relationships with India. Actually, I first visited India, I think the year before your association was established. I went in '65. Amazingly as it now seems, we travelled through Punjab, Haryana, what's now Madhya Pradesh. And this was the last year before the Green Revolution took hold in North India. And there were cities in what is now very prosperous northwest India, like Jalandhar, Amritsar, where people were hungry. And the distance we have travelled since, in terms of basic material progress, is remarkable. I mean, India is now a major country, middle-income country almost. The extreme poverty that I experienced has largely gone. I should just say that on the return journey, the war broke out a few hours later, '65. I was briefly interned as a Pakistan spy. That may seem as rather improbable, but that's my first encounter with the politics of the subcontinent, which I have subsequently written about in a novel that appeared this year. It's half set in India and half set here, and it does relate to those underlying themes and tensions that still exist. But I'll say a little bit about the Brexit issue because it does dominate British politics. I know that for many people it is very boring. We're going over and over these arguments constantly. It's now been going on for 2 years. We're very much in the detailed, complex negotiating issues. There are a whole lot of other things that we perhaps ought to be talking about. How you deal with an ageing population and care, how you fund universities, how we achieve an economy that's more adjusted to artificial intelligence and automation. All those things are being sidelined while we focus on this one single issue. And it is proving to be very divisive. There was a survey recently which some of you may have seen reference to, where people were asked what they thought about marrying somebody of a different religion, different colour. And it seemed that the British had become much more tolerant and were quite open to this idea of marrying out, except in one respect. They thought it was unforgivable to marry somebody who came from the other side of the referendum. So Brexiters should not marry Remainers and vice versa. And it is divisive. And it's divisive also, I've discovered, amongst the various ethnic minorities in the UK. I think by and large the black and Muslim groups in the UK voted to remain. They saw it as an issue around British nationalism and immigration, and they felt they should identify with the Remain movement. But the Indian community, of people of Indian origin, was much more split. There were some who followed Priti Patel on the Conservative side, some who supported Jeremy Corbyn, both of them Brexit-oriented politicians, and that division of opinion continues to this day. I see in the House of Commons, sometimes I'm sitting opposite Asian members of the government who are promoting Brexit. At the same time, I vote with some Conservative or Labour rebels, Rashanara Ali, Rupa Haq, Seema Malhotra, people like this who have rebelled against their parties and who are supporting the Remain movement. But I just want to start off with that basic theme, that it is a very divisive issue, and we still have 6 months to go. It isn't at all clear how this issue is going to be resolved. if it ever is resolved. I think you know basically my party's view, that we take the view that leaving the European Union is bad for the country, very damaging. There isn't an upside. It takes us away from a lot of the cooperative arrangements on environment and human rights, to creating greater peace in Europe, which as historically, of course, has been disfigured by war, brings countries together that have a common democratic approach. We believe we should stay in, and at the end of the negotiating process, we will be fighting and campaigning to make sure that the public have a vote on the final deal, with the hope of staying in the European Union. But we're the only party that is taking this view at the moment, though we're working hard to convince others of that course of action. I think it's fair to say that the kind of political environment that we're now operating in is very different from that which prevailed when your association was originally established. I think we all then talked about the language of right and left in a reasonably coherent way, and when I talked to my Indian friends, there was on the one hand people like Moraja Desai and the Swatantra Party, and on the other hand there were socialists and communists in India, and you could have a meaningful conversation about right versus left and people in the middle. But that world has disappeared. In this country, right and left doesn't mean anything anymore. You have Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn taking the same position broadly on Brexit, something like anti-Semitism. It's both on the extreme right and the extreme left. So what do those things mean? In India, we have the BJP, people identifying on the basis of religion, nationality, caste. The old politics has disappeared. We're in a world where some people have called the politics of identity. I wrote about this 20 years ago, and I didn't think it would ever happen. But I was trying to describe a world where people thought about politics in the UK, about Scotland, immigration, our future in Europe, rather than about the things we've traditionally debated. And that's the world we're now in. We're in that world in the UK. And in India, it is an issue of identity rather than the traditional politics. And in this new world, there are some people who are primarily concerned with inward-lookingness, being nationalistic, stressing their ethnic identity, and others, myself, my party, which is more outward-looking, inclusive, wanted to be part of international organizations, being reasonably relaxed about immigration, for example, and wanting to encourage it to look outward. Now, as these negotiations proceed, one of the key issues on which we are now divided is this whole question of international trade and the ability of the British government to negotiate trade relationships with countries like India. It strikes me as being a rather phony argument, but nonetheless the proposition is being made that unless we leave the European Union, we will not be able to have proper trade relationships with countries like India. Now this strikes me as being wrong for all kinds of reasons. Even when we were fully committed to the European Union, we actively traded. I was involved as business secretary in rounds of negotiation with my opposite number in India. It was then the Congress coalition government. But we actively talked about the promotion of trade and investment. There's nothing to stop us doing that. Countries like Germany, France were actively involved in trade promotion, even though they were members of the European Union. That being in Europe didn't stop us having a special relationship with India. And India's own willingness to negotiate some separate arrangement with the UK, I think it's very improbable. India is, as you know, a fairly inward-looking country on trade matters. It wants something in return for any concessions they give, and what they want in return is more visas. And the British government's made it very clear that they're not willing to do that. So what is the basis on which some new relationship is going to be forged? It's very far from clear. And India's own relationship with the world are very much geared around trade relationships with other developing countries. There isn't a single trade deal that India has struck with a developed country. They've been trying for 10 years to get an agreement with Australia. Why should an agreement with the UK suddenly happen? And it's going to be very difficult to reach an agreement, whatever happens. But I think we should now begin to think ahead a little bit to what the world should be like if Brexit does happen. I say some of us are trying to stop it happening, but in all probability in just over a year's time we could find ourselves in the UK outside the European Union. And I put the question is, what does this mean for our relationship with Indian communities in Britain and with India externally? First of all, our relationship in many ways is governed economically by a very substantial amount of Indian investment in the UK. Our biggest manufacturing company in Britain is Indian. The Tata Group, companies like Reliance have been heavily engaged in the UK, and the question is this going to continue if Britain leaves Europe? I think I'm under the impression that companies like Jaguar Land Rover are based here because they are part of the European network, but it remains to be seen. But another basic question is, how is it going to affect immigration? The whole issue about family visits, about visas for professionals, about overseas students. At the moment the climate has been negative. The last few weeks people in the UK have been more well disposed, I think, following the Windrush scandal. But I suspect myself that we're not, as a country, going to open up suddenly. But it is a question we need to think about. I mean, how is all of this going to come about? And then finally, reflecting on what was happening yesterday in Quebec. I mean, we're in a very dangerous world where all the things that we've rather taken for granted, relative freedom of trade, international agreements, the United Nations system, countries cooperating, broadly speaking, that is now falling apart. The traditional alliances between America and Europe and Japan are disintegrating, in which America's closest relationship is becoming that with Russia, which is bizarre when you think back 2 or 3 years to the way the world used to be. So how are we going to relate to India, which will in future be the 3rd biggest economy in the world after China and the United States? What kind of relationship is it going to have? What kind of relationship will it have with the UK, with Europe? And it's a very different environment in which we're operating. And I don't have clear answers to these questions. I can put the questions, but I don't know what the answers are. But I do know that having associations like your own, which do bring people together, reflect on these issues, is valuable. I hope, as your patron, I continue to be involved in the discussions you have, and I thank you very much for inviting me here. But thank you.